Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. It's the first cold night in many months. Got something on my mind. I want to just go through it almost for my own sake. I spent the day in an amazing meeting working on a new script. But this time I'm getting to collaborate with a great production team who had the concept in the first place. And it's probably, without comparison, the most educated folks I've worked with on a film and on writing a new concept. And the subject came up, and I forgot to. There's a teacher cited about this, so there's a whole thing out there about this. I'm going to give you my impression of this, and even if you're not interested in writing, you've never written before, you have no intent on writing, I think what's going to happen in this episode is I'm going to get your mind to reminisce. And if you're older and you're trying to ever in your life explain your past, this episode will come in extremely handy for you to be able to articulate sort of why things are different today and why you really can't put the lightning back in the bottle, to give your kids an impression of what it would be like to be in your childhood. And this is something, as a screenwriter, you're really attempting to do it most cases. If you're not doing it, you should try to do it, because it is the difference between succeeding and failing, in my opinion. And I should probably preface that by, if you're going to write a period piece that is in the past, I would say near past being your lifetime. So if you're 50 years old, you got 50 years of life to really talk about, maybe minus 7 to 10 for you waking up to what is actually going on. But I think you can pretty much start nailing it the second you start remembering days within a particular year. Because for me personally, I remember very specific days, before I could even talk, but just a day, and then it was 2 or 3 days, and then it was a few different experiences. But around 7 years old, I don't know what happened to my mind. Some little neurons connected. This is for me, and I'm sure you have a different timetable, where I just remember everything. Like the same amount that I remember about last year is the same amount I remembered about being 7. What was interesting, I remembered, and what wasn't, it was repetition. But the way that they're talking about it today is sort of a screenwriting / story consciousness. So this applies to anything that you're doing. If you're a playwright, if you're a novelist, this applies to you. And the very first time this was ever brought up to me, today was the very first day it was actually described as consciousness. And I think that's a great word. And apparently there's a teacher out there that teaches consciousness and writing. But I asked my writing mentor / guru teacher, who has sold over 20 scripts in his lifetime, and he's directed a very legendary film back in the day. I always kind of keep his name out of this in case he doesn't want to be mentioned. He's a very private person. But he grew up in the 60s as a college graduate and what have you, and so he finished his high school years in the 60s, and then he got through college, and then he immediately jumped into the business of telling story one way or another. Totally self-made guy, which is awesome. But he was painting the story for me at lunch one day, and I said, why don't you write that script? Just write anything back in that era, because you're an amazing storyteller and you have ample material. Why don't you just write that script? Just figure out anything. I mean, how many, Norman Rockwell kind of movies do we have that reach back in the past from today? There's a ton of them. Sometimes they're historical. But he told me, he said, you can't. You can't do it. And I said, why can't you do it? He said, because, and he didn't say consciousness, but this is really what he was talking about. He says, everything that made people feel and think a particular way, made all of the events of that era mean a particular thing to them. And because society has evolved 50, 60 years away from that time period, you will never understand what that feels like today. Because you have you have terrorism and gangster shit, and you've got all this modern thinking. And I like to write in period myself. My very first film I ever wrote was set in 79. My next film was like 2500 BC. My next film was inside a computer, and the next film was 1985. Now, I lived in 79, and I remember it. I lived in 85, so I remember it. And I tried to instill this consciousness into my story, but honestly, achieving this is on purely paper with words is probably one of the most impossible things you can attempt to do. I think you can do it to a certain extent, and you're going to need to talk to your director, and he or she's going to have to get what you're trying to do. Stranger Things did this. Probably Stranger Things is interesting. When I was a kid, they released the movie Grease. And it's a musical, so it's not really trying to be that serious. And Stranger Things is definitely a caricature to a degree of reality. But Stranger Things for me is the furthest back I've seen someone accurately capture gigantic portions of what it was like to live in that era. And what they did was they sort of pulled out the very best of different places in the United States and pushed them all in one story. So you may not have a really banging mall like the one in season 3 in the area where these kids live. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. Maybe a more metropolitan area has the Sherman Oaks Mall that Fast Times at Ridgemont High was filmed in. Now, what's great, just as a point of reference, we all know this, films that are made in those decades, like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which again is a caricature in large part of certain aspects of the way it was like to live in those eras, but I have to say it's probably more accurate than less accurate, or more accurate than caricature. I would almost put Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I did grow up in California, so that's the only reason why I don't quite know the exact percentage, but I would say it's probably 75, 85% correct. But it's because it was filmed in those eras. When you look at the clothing, well, that's what kids were wearing in Southern California, Los Angeles, Sherman Oaks area. I moved here, in 87, so I know what California was like from 87 to 90, and I will tell you, the consciousness of this place took a really bad turn. Just as a point of reference, before I jump into this real deep, I think that the world we live in today is so utterly raw. This era that we live in is full of pain. And it's not an old country, no country for old men thing. The kids today live in pain. That is why everyone is so angry. They're so easily venting hate towards anything that they believe in. Boy, life isn't the way it should be, and hate. Even for life that is good for people, they still find the hate arc. It's really easy. You might hate the haters, it's an ancestral, horrible thing. Now, I'm going to come at this from an American perspective. That's all I can give you. America has definitely been through some hard times. Now, whether or not Americans choose to harvest hate and dislike and anger towards their hard times depends on the standards and the morals and the expectations of humanity. So let's just say your late 1800s where children were being sent off to factories. Parents would sell their kids to factories, and they just get on a train and disappear forever. That's where all those child labor laws came from. But take Deadwood, South Dakota. If you get the DVD series of the fictional show on HBO, based on true characters in large part, you hear about the history, and it was a tough world, and people just accepted it. This is what we have to do. They knew no other world. So they didn't see, things were better and now they're worse. It's just, you were born into this. You're in the Midwest plains of America, in this Sioux Nation sort of, I know what you call it, a valley, where there's a lot of gold, The Louisiana Purchase hadn't finished up yet, so they were there well, maybe it had finished up, but they were outside the jurisdiction of the United States because it was Sioux Nation, so they were able to have their own law. And of course, as soon as the government finds out that there's gold, they're going to start pushing in for that reason, and eventually, the whole place is joined the rest of the Union, right? So the thing you can't do with a film or a story or your kids, you can't regress them back to your innocence. And so when you say things are funny or things are interesting, they may not get it at all. And when you go back and see, one of the easiest ways to see this is to look at television sitcoms from any one of the decades in the past and see what really motivated a population to make a particular show the funniest show on TV. Go watch any, and it really, in my opinion, because I mainly grew up in this decade as a child, but I watched all the reruns from the 60s, reruns from the 50s, even the 40s with George and Gracie. They actually were more sophisticated in the past. Then things got really dumbed down in the 70s, but you go watch all the shows from the 70s and early mid 80s or what have you, and there's this endearing innocence to the humor. It's not really funny for us anymore. Go watch Mork and Mindy, for God's sakes, and tell me anything really makes you laugh. But you have to know that when that show came out, we were in stitches at home at a level that was astonishing. I mean, I remember watching Mork and Mindy with my mother, my father, different times, and we would just be laughing something. We look around the room like, this is really super mega funny. I'm a child, so you might think, well, you're just a little kid. Him going nanu nanu and all that stuff may have been just something that a child would appreciate. And the truth of the matter was, my mom was crying tears of laughter. My dad thought it was funny. And my dad loved Star Trek and that kind of stuff. Steve Martin. And what was it? Steve Martin, I always mention these guys, George Carlin, Richard Pryor, are three of the funniest guys in the world in the 1970s. Steve Martin was able to charge incredible amounts of money for his performances. Same with the other two guys. And the reason why is that their jokes were considered the funniest jokes ever at the time. For the Innocence. Now, what's crazy about it is you might, when I think back about the Vietnam War, technically I'm alive for, I guess, 5.5 years of that war's existence. I don't remember any of it at all. I don't remember anyone mistreating soldiers. I don't remember any of that. It happened. So we just had a giant portion of the middle class, not nowhere near a majority, it may even be a single percentile rating of people that went to Vietnam and came back. And they reintegrated with their families. And my dad, being in the military, definitely had people around us who went there, did gnarly stuff, man. But they're still able to laugh at all the stuff on TV. Plus, all that stuff was on television. All this horrible suffering of Vietnam was on TV. It was one of the first first wars. Excuse me, maybe it is a movie. One of the first wars where they integrated, live footage from the battlefield right on, the nightly news. It was the thing that sold advertising, right? So even sitting at home, not going to war, people were extremely aware of it. Look at the hippie movement protesting the war. And maybe they're too drugged out to really understand the massacres of it. But I tell you what, if you're sitting there on an acid trip thinking about the Vietnam War, and especially seeing these gruesome things on TV, I remember seeing, guerrilla warfare in South America being broadcast on the TV, and I thought they were gorillas. I thought they were, big, what is it, amphibian? No, not amphibians, primates, right? I saw a bed sheet with blood on it on the TV, and I thought, oh my gosh, they got a big gorilla problem down. So I thought I was afraid of gorillas. So we were seeing all that, but we still had goofy, wonderful, bright souls that were creating, R&B, rap music. We had, it was heavy metal. It wasn't really in existence. We had rock and roll. But the songs were like about, cat scratch fever, and, you get the drug tripped out, Dark Side of the Moon coming around. You have just, Black Sabbath bringing in some pretty intense, grooves and lyrics. But we had disco. My God. Go watch, just go on YouTube and watch Soul Train. And you will get an idea of how innocent we were as a people. That'll never be put back in a bottle unless we can fix society in such a way that all of us feel that way. But this episode's about the consciousness of writing. Now, the way I write, as I've said several times on the show, is that I literally sneak in. This is the way I say it. I don't actually physically see this event occurring necessarily, but I'm in a movie theater looking at the movie that I'm supposed to be writing, and it's almost like I'm not supposed to be there. I had a dream once where I actually dreamed part of the Tron sequel I participated in and wrote, where I was literally looking to my right and seeing the screen, and I felt like, oh my God, there it is, finished. I don't have to even do anything. I just sit and watch it. And in a dream, everything is perfect the way you want it if you're being creative. Music sounds amazing, like I always say. And so it's my effort to remember and wake up and try to figure out, okay, what was making that moment occur? Because it's not just words coming out of people's mouths. In fact, it's probably only 20% the words, and the rest of the 80% is divided up between the style of the way that the world looks in the movie, the ways everything's lit, the palette that's there, and more importantly, the palette that's not there. The light that is there and the light that isn't there. The music, if there is anything, the sound effects that are there. All of that contributes to making up this image of reality that will be the final product. But it still has to be perceived by the audience of the times, right? We have these movies in history which are known as cult classics, right? And cult classics are almost always related to where was society at the time this particular movie came out. What society was obviously tired of the other escapes that had been presented to them, and this film, whichever one you want to name, from Wizard of Oz to Snow White, huge one, Snow White, to like Star Wars, to Blade Runner. Star Wars made Blade Runner explode. For those of us who saw it back in the day and loved it immediately, it was this gritty, amazing future noir thing at a time when everything was super sci-fi, which is science fiction, which means it doesn't have to be real. Millennium Falcon doing a barrel roll. There's nothing wrong with that stuff. But we had seen the first one, New Hope, and we had seen Empire Strikes Back, and soon Return of the Jedi was coming. And one of the reasons why Return of the Jedi at the very end seemed very corny to everyone is that we had crawled out of that sort of goofy sci-fi into the more serious science fiction. Tell me a story that is based on scientific fact to the best of your ability. Of course, Kubrick bang went out in the 60s, but then everyone was in the space age trying to go to the moon back in that time frame, so he was congruent with what was there, and then of course he took it to level 11 with a bunch of help from other folks and his own brilliance, and so it will stand the test of time. But after the Vietnam War, we start unequivocally the best decade, of filmmaking. But guess what? If I sat down an average kid today and said, okay, I have picked out 10 of the best films, and that's probably 1982 all by itself. Maybe I have to do 20 or 30 of the best films between 1975 and 1985. They may or may not understand why any of these films were amazing. America starts the Vietnam War in 63 and ends at middle of 74. The cleanup's probably taking quite quite a bit longer than that. So we were in this world that was tumultuous and acidic, and people are being drafted. Although people were more drafted in previous wars, this one was bad, and people died, and everybody knew someone who didn't come home, or people came home with PTSD situations, and we didn't know how to deal with it. We call it shell shock, and that was it. You just deal with it on your own. It's despicable how countries treat their soldiers. Finally, in this last term of presidency in the United States, at least we're treating our vets right. The country should be ashamed. But it takes a few years to really pull together this surge of films that comes in 1975, because everything has to be in progress to release at a particular perfect moment in time. The big thing about Snow White is it releases in 1936, along with other amazing films in that time frame. But it is the first animated film with synchronized speaking on top of a animated character. The animation's ridiculous. The animation's amazing. And yes, they did trace film at one point to get certain things to go right, but come on, it's still a hell of a lot of work, and it looks amazing. But that film made a tremendous amount of money and launched the Disney enterprise to the next level. But when I remember each decade of my life, I remember several things. The average music on television, the average music on the radio and how it makes everyone feel. Music was such a huge thing in the 70s. The quality was ridiculous. Okay? There's a reason why when you sing karaoke or you go to a karaoke bar, there's so much stuff coming out of the 70s and the 80s that people sing. Young kids are singing it. And they even go back, to the 50s and sing Frank Sinatra, because this is real sound, man. So they've been blessed decade after decade after this. 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Preceded the 70s, obviously, and each one of those decades came up with legendary artists. Today, it's all just created in a tiny little bedroom, and it sounds like it. The other part is the clothes that we wore. Society goes through these weird, obviously reinventions, but we have been lost for 30 years. Ever since grunge happened, we've been lost. There was no expression. It was sort of anti-expression, and that's okay too. Punk rock was sort of anti-expression, but look at how punk rockers looked amazing. I mean, they're formidable, and they're little Nazi people sometimes. They turn into skinheads or something like that. But they didn't just become a punk rocker. Some folks did mohawks, which is a hell of a lot of effort. They just looked phenomenal. When I first moved to the Bay Area in the early 90s, there was a bunch of punk rockers at De Anza College from England. And some of them weren't in the college, and they were just always around. But it was like purebred punk rockers that look like, and they're young. I mean, they're 18 to 22 at a time when they're a decade beyond that, what we had already done here in America, having poached a bunch of punk rock movements from the British Isles, as they might say, in the late 70s, early 80s, where it really got super intense. The way our homes looked, how we filled up our houses with things. You would have finishes. When you went to retail locations, they had a look that was one way or the other. The amount of incredible original artwork that came out of the 60s and 70s due to drug use, I don't know if it'll ever be equaled in the near future. It might take 50 to 100 years to get society back up to that point where we don't demonize drugs that don't hurt your body, so you can see love, you can feel God, you can connect all the dots of humanity and go, why do I hate you again? I don't know, man. Give me a hug. Choosh, And so art popped out of that. Colors were chosen, shapes were chosen. Album covers were just unbelievably creative. Now we don't even have album covers. I mean, we kind of do, but everyone's trying to look hard. Go to, blabbermouth.net, I think it is. It's a rock and roll website for a bunch of guys from the 80s. God bless them. Love the fact they're still going. But, 9 out of 10 album covers are, these guys trying to look as hard as possible on the cover. It's like, stop already. Did you ever see the album covers out of the 80s and 70s, guys? If the band members were even on the front, you were lucky. An album was supposed to give you a full-blown virtual reality experience. You look at the album, and the artist has prepared artwork that is harmonizing with the music that they chose. If you were lucky, you got a poster. If you were super lucky, the album had some really cool art on the center. Maybe it was a colored album. Usually the lyrics were on the insert, around the vinyl itself. Prince was one of the most amazing musicians at doing this. He would literally create an album that just had a wild feel, and you'd be a little disoriented on the next album. It'd take you a little while to understand his next sound. Would make it happen. He was creating like a subculture inside, or subconscious inside this overall consciousness, trying to get everyone to the next level of where he was in music. This affects everything. How people spoke was completely different from decade to decade. And yeah, you got totally tubular, and that's awesome, and all that kind of stuff. We still say awesome too much, probably. I'm definitely a violator of that. But you go watch old 50s beatnik movies, and you hear that daddy-o and what's up, cat, you're a square cat, all that kind of stuff. Man, it's awesome. When you really watch the Twilight Zones, especially the one where the 3 aliens came down from outer space and they're dressed like greasers as their cover, they wrote the dialogue, the way they talked. My uncle was a greaser back in the day before he became an optometrist, The consciousness is really the boundaries by which your actors, your characters, and your script will be constrained willingly. It is their nature. But the world has a nature too. Every element of the world has a nature to it. So picking your soundtracks, like a lot of crappy movies try to make it not so crappy by playing, one-hit wonder hits all the way through the movie to keep you on board. Well, this scene sucks, but I really like that song. Or if you're gullible, you'll actually map the song onto a crappy scene and give the crappy scene a whole bunch of credit just because the song's playing in the background. What's cool about Stranger Things and the brilliant writing that those brothers do is that they beautifully constrain the language of the kids. When I was a kid, the first time I ever heard the F-bomb, I can't remember which one was first. My dad was whispering to my mom something, and he used the F-bomb, obviously not at her. They weren't remotely arguing. He was talking about something at work. He just whispered it, and he just used it. And I was like, ooh, what's that word, And then I was at a jukebox at a Dairy Queen in Derby, Kansas, and some 2 kids were talking about songs, and they used the word, and I still had no idea what it meant. So I was hearing a really dirty word, and it was really funny how the mind knows that that's an off-limit phrase. But we were good kids. I've told you guys several times on the show that, if you watch Good Times, set in New York City, I don't know if it's the Bronx or maybe it's the Bronx, I think, or I can't remember where it was, but it's a struggling family in New York, African-American family, if you will, black family. And JJ, I think his last name's Evans. I don't know. JJ, he's like an heirloom to 70s television. Everybody in the world knew who JJ was. Everyone loved that guy. And he was always just this, because he's really super young when the series starts. And it's on TV for I don't even know how many years. As he grows up to be a full man, a young man on this show. He gets really tall. It's really funny. But he has this amazing charm and charisma about him that he can throw an insult out with a big smile on his face. And it was a hilarious character that this guy, he's still alive, I think, but he had this thing. And there was an episode where he got recruited into a gang in New York. And the big thing was that they gave him a gun and told him he had to use it on somebody during some gang-on-gang fight. And I mean, everyone watching the show thought, oh my God, a gun. That's like so out there. That is so overboard. Now, real New York was definitely acclimated to using a gun every once in a while. But there was a reason why during the Rolling Stone concert where they happened to use the Hells Angels as a security detail, and a guy pulled out a gun and started waving it around the crowd. And of course, Hell's Angels guys are not someone you want to mess with, especially the ones in the 70s. I mean, I don't even know how these guys got so hard. I don't know if they're all Vietnam vets. I don't know what the deal was, but they were formidable, personified, okay? Within seconds of this guy waving his gun, a dude stabbed him and killed him. And it was just, this is inappropriate. You're now threatening people's lives. You could just pull that trigger and someone could die. And the dude who killed him just took all those variables into account and killed the guy. Obviously horrible on all ends of that story. But that's sort of how it worked. If you were that foolish to bring out a weapon at a concert and you think there's something so important that you got to bring out a weapon to get your point across, you're obviously in outer space. You know, you have a low IQ. You're just not processing reality correctly. But then here comes the equal force the other way, and you see the footage of this guy's just a big-ass switchblade, man. Just boom, nails this guy. And that changed concerts forever. It changed the consciousness forever. If you ever heard about anyone else getting killed at a concert, well, as much as you're surprised after the very first time, well, that's just what happens sometimes, honey. But we managed to enter the 80s at this ridiculously awesome, let me just use that word, level of consciousness where the clothing hit this wild stride. I mean, we were wearing all kinds of weird stuff, parachute pants, and Michael Jackson had his Beat It jacket everybody wanted to own. I mean, it was so funny about the Beat It jacket is, I can tell you, and this is part of the consciousness of the time, there were probably very few kids in their teens, okay, and at least their early, maybe 16 and under, who wouldn't take that jacket in a heartbeat, wouldn't buy it if they could buy it. But you look at it today and you wouldn't be caught dead wearing that thing. And that's usually how it goes with all the different cultures, right? When you offer a script to someone where you are trying to capture that lightning in a bottle and they didn't live in that era, think about how tough it is for that person reading that script to ever figure it out. I'm debating in my mind right now whether to make this a screenwriting episode or just an episode. I think it's extremely important for writers to understand this. What's interesting is when I watch, and none of us know what's true. If you watch a Western like Unforgiven, for instance, they can make the world raw because the Western time frame, let's just say 1850 to maybe 1880, where it's really that Wild West where all the stories come from, it has less moving parts. And so perhaps it's a little bit easier to let the land dictate the environment. You're in a log cabin. You're in a very, hastily put together wood house or hotel or saloon or something. And then the clothing was fairly unified back in those days. Very simple. There weren't a lot of choices. But once you bring it into reality today, holy crap. We now have millions and millions of choices about how we build each one of our homes, how we dress, how we do our hair, how we talk, what words we're going to use. Are we going to swear a little bit or are we not going to swear? Do we go to church or not go to church? Do we drive a fancy car or not a fancy car? Do we live in a fancy house? Do we have a studio apartment? Are we young and struggling because we have no money? Or are we, relaxing in our 50s, 60s, and 70s because we made a nest egg and it's working out? So many elements to it. The thing I miss the most about the 70s and the 80s, and I guess the last half of the 70s and all of the 80s, was the innocence and good nature of mankind. There's the video on YouTube that's been watched several times, which someone walked into a 7-Eleven. I mentioned it once before. And they just filmed people hanging out in a 7-Eleven. And everybody was goofy and funny and had good intent for each other. And I think it was here in LA. A guy went around and just talked to people. He got a video camera, which was something that was a big deal. A color video camera was only a few homes had it because they cost a lot of money. Now everyone has a 4K one and they call it a telephone. So the idea that someone might say, well, that's just because you were young and you were innocent, so you view it through your innocent eyes. Not really. I understand there's a portion of that. Believing in Santa Claus definitely has that magic that is not going to be in my adult at the same exact time. But if they can vicariously look at me having the experience, they can live it one more time themselves. But no, the 70s and 80s had this innocence. There's a movie called The Car from 1975, and there's a scene where this car, which is the devil, it's an amazing movie, man, but you'll watch it and you'll go, man, it's super corny. The way the cops were talking to each other on the radios, the car had actually pinned a whole group of kids in a cemetery with a few women that were watching them because they were practicing for band. The men were rushing to the scene because they're all cops and they're trying to, corner this thing, and it's taking time to get there, and so this woman in these bell-bottom pants and her 70s haircut, she thinks it's a kid in a car, and so she deals with kids. She knows what it's like, and so she starts yelling at what she thinks is a kid in the car, calling him names, calling him a jackass. I forgot what she said. I don't know, like a horse's ass or something. She said she used a very kind of not very dirty words, but in the time it was a big deal. And this is a horror movie where people are getting killed, all right? And still the dialogue wouldn't breach a certain level because we didn't. Smokey and the Bandit, another great two movies that, you have to understand, man. Smokey and the Bandit owned America for the moment that Sally Fields and Burt Reynolds hopped in that car. Was it Jerry Reed? Was his name? Jerry Reeves? Reed? The dude that played the sheriff, whose name escapes me. He's so famous. He was in The Honeymooners. He played the sheriff, and he would say, some bitch or something like that. And man, it was like, oh my God, he said that word, But this is adults, and everyone was just into this movie. It was the way we behaved. Of course, it's a little bit juiced up because Burt Reynolds was an odyssey back in those days of just absolute confidence, and he's a very handsome guy back in the day. Sally Fields, every dude had a crush on her. She was the cutest little thing on planet Earth. But Eastbound Down, I think that song, whatever that song was, that Jerry Reed, pretty sure that's his name, played, was huge on the radio. It was huge in the movie. I know you filmed me, but I want you to think this thing through for where we are today. What is escapism today? Escapism is a bunch of Marvel movies today. They're really well done. Most of them are all really well done. Spider-Man, not so much. The new Spider-Man was great, and then he's gone now. I think Iron Man 3 was the other kind of floppy movie. It's too repetitive. But everything else, which is the overwhelming majority, is funny. They're doing funny now, which is great. But now we create entire consciousness separate from the consciousness that we're in. And that's fine. That's an art unto itself. Tron Legacy, they're whole different worlds. Once you get inside the computer, everything's different. Daft Punk is controlling your brain with the music. The incredible designers who made that world just took you to a different place. Now, the script was junk, but the actors showed up for work. They're trying to do their best with these crappy lines. But, in the end, you kind of like the whole experience because of the consciousness saved the film, not the individual words spoken. Pixar for a long time was able to create that consciousness. And it seems like Pixar was initially, in my opinion, plagued with talent, such that making sequels has never really worked out for Pixar. Oh, they might make money, but no one really likes them better than the first. Toy Story 1 will always be a consciousness experience that you had never experienced before. The way that these things were modeled, animated, voiced over, the story was amazing, everything was new, and the script did all their initial scripts do one thing extremely well, which prevents them from creating accurate recreations in a sequel that replicates the consciousness, which is that if you have a mechanism that is comedy, in that particular case, all these kids' toys were alive, and they were trying to help the kid. But every time the kid walked in the room, they all laid down on the ground like they were dead, right? Like they were just toys. Well, they had exhausted, through brilliant writing, every gag that those toys could have done. And the only thing that you can do to create a Toy Story 2 would be to create all brand new toys that somehow have the potential gag level that is original, not used by the previous toys, in a completely separate world, such that it all feels new and amazing like the first film. Star Wars, not so much. Star Wars, epic talent in all areas, but the saga had just revealed a tiny, thumbnail of the world that was the rebels against the Imperial forces. And so they had infinite real estate to keep going with that story. I bet Lucas, if he could live his life over again, would have created 4, 5, and 6 in the 80s with all those actors alive instead of stopping. He probably needed a break, but I bet 20th Century Fox is kicking themselves every day for not taking it on. And look at what they're trying to do now with the new ones. They can't do it. There isn't a single Star Wars sequel, prequel that can get you back to Star Wars. I think Rogue One was the closest one. Why? Because they started a brand new story with brand new characters as some little, how did they get the plans for the Death Star? There's a lot of criticism about that film until they started seeing the other films, and they finally are going back to Rogue One and saying, it's got some ridiculous scenes in it, but the overwhelming majority of the film puts you in the Star Wars world, takes you places you've never been, and it's nice. The story is good. It portrays all the power of various vehicles in new ways. So if you're doing a movie today, obviously the stream of consciousness, as long as you're loyal to the reality that we're in and you measure your suspension of disbelief mechanisms to get anything to happen in your script, right? If you're writing things that are totally possible, you don't need to bend the rules that much to get things to occur. It's your job to make things believable but mind-blowing, if that's what the kind of script you're trying to do. And again, most scripts don't really have that problem. Current day scripts, right? With Black Mirror, they take a little piece of technology, they advance it forward, and they make sure that that little piece of technology is going to create incredible conflict between characters, and then they beautifully isolate what that conflict would be, and they develop characters that are for it, characters that are against it, and characters that are affected by it, positively and negatively. And so at the end, you have these beautiful little 1-hour shows. Westworld is probably one of the most recent masterpieces, season 1 especially, that's been put on film. Tremendous, world they created. They get the sophisticated world, they get the Western world. You get humans, you get androids, and then they put this super deep story with Ed Harris in it about trying to find the center of the maze. You don't even know what the maze is until the end of the last show, episode 10, season 1, you find out what the maze is. Phenomenal. Took me 3 or 4 times watching that show to really understand what the hell was going on, because time started jumping around so much at the end I started getting lost. First time I watched it. Of course, I'm doing other things at the same time. So how far back in time, let's just say, from today, would you have to go to start worrying about consciousness? It depends on history, for one. Today, things are extremely dynamic. 3 years ago in America, things were way different, depending on what kind of story you're telling. But 10 years ago, you're almost guaranteed things were different. We had an epic moment in reality in 2001 that basically stole consciousness away from at least Americans 100%. I think the rest of the world was fairly negatively affected, at least in first world nations. It is my hope that there are third world countries that don't frankly give a damn and they're unaffected by it. That way they don't lose their world, whatever that world is. But we used to go to an airport without getting, scanned and frisked and all this other stuff. We didn't have the narrative of negativity such that, there's some random boogeyman around every corner trying to kill us. We didn't have that. As weird as the 90s were, most of us thought, okay, well, the 90s are going through this thing, this super rebellious doodad, privileged white kids are walking around like they're broke. Woe is me, I'm so utterly alone, was essentially the mantra of the 90s. And so most of us thought, that'll just blow over. We'll get back to, wouldn't you rather be in a nice world like it was in the 80s? When I moved to California in 87, I've said this once before, many moons ago, I was stunned. I was here, right? You dream about being in California if you're not from here, in America at least. And I had things to do. I wasn't just here to look at palm trees and Disneyland. I had, programming career, a writing career I wanted to get into. I had a million dreams, be an artist, whatever. And you can do anything you want in Los Angeles. I mean, it's here. But I used to go down to Rodeo Drive with friends and just walk the art galleries. I used to go to the late night performances of the Hollywood Bowl for free, because at one particular time of night you can go in for free and watch classical music. It's beautiful. Used to go to Venice Beach all the time, man. Seeing the Chainsaw Juggling Man, the one-man band, Michael Collier performing. Michael Collier, who won Ed McMahon's big contest. It was $100,000 or $150,000 or whatever it was. He won, and none of us were surprised he won. If you saw him on Venice Beach, the guy was his own level of consciousness, but he derived it from the good intentions of the 80s, and he came right off the streets, man. He dominated. He's considered the godfather of Venice Beach. Then in the 90s, Venice Beach turned into a horrible, drug-infested, gang-violent area. It was bad. And I was in the Bay Area at the time. So when I came back to visit Venice a little later, it was a little toughened up, a little bit different. Still fun. Steven Spielberg was able to put the 80s in a bottle like nobody else that I know of by filming in the era and filming correctly. He filmed E.T. and Poltergeist, which were, I think, released in 82, right around the same time in the same neighborhoods. I think Simi Valley or something was used. But if you want to see how the world was for average kids, I think the Poltergeist beginning, where I think it starts off with a guy on a bicycle, a grown adult on a girl's bike or something like that, some banana seat bike, and he's got this beer with him. It's either a 2 6-packs or a 12-pack. I don't know if they had 12-packs back then, but he's dropping beers, trying to ride his bike, and these little kids have a remote control car which they race in front of his tires to knock him over, and he's just trying to get the beers to the house because the game is on. Even though I lived in Massachusetts at the time and then quickly moved back to Kansas around that time frame, which is a completely different world. Southern California and the Midwest was completely different. Massachusetts completely different than in both those places. The attitude of that first opening scene and sort of how the adults were fighting over remote controls, changing each other's TVs, and he goes, "Look, man, I'm trying to watch the games, and my kid wants to watch this TV show." They're trying to change the channel, and they're fighting over back and forth. That was the name of the game. That's just how we communicated. Now here's sort of the undertow message of this whole episode, which is this. I think consciousness in America has been very similar in overall family level consciousness for almost 20 years now. And I think we took several steps backwards in several areas and some steps forward, but most backwards. I'm very glad that Los Angeles doesn't have the gang violence that it used to have. These guys all got older and wanted to have kids, and the cops wanted to do the same thing, and so they ended up calming down. Like I said, I talked to that LAPD guy who was retiring the following year with his best buddy next to him who worked his first 10 years with the other dude. And I asked him, I said, isn't the world in LA a lot better? And he goes, oh yeah, man, way better. He goes, now I pull over a guy every once in a while and I'll look inside the window and he's one of the old gangbangers. And we just reminisce about the fact that we survived. And he goes, I don't give him a ticket. He just goes home. We're so glad that both of us are alive and that we're not running that old game anymore. The other thing that Hollywood doesn't allow most of the time, which I hope returns, directors are trying to return to this, but I don't think that they're focusing on the consciousness being established while they're trying to do it. And that is the art of establishing shots. Giving the camera some time just to sit and ingest the world and ingest it on these levels that we're talking about. The music, the architecture, the clothing, how people tell a joke, how people deal with conflicts or what have you. Now, those are a little sophisticated for establishing a shot. But you watch old movies from the past and oh my God, you'll have scenes that go on for minutes, 4 or 5 minutes. Nothing is being spoken. They're just moving the camera around slowly, allowing people to exist, showing just there's no real dialogue that's pointed at you. If there's dialogue, it's just sort of like chatter in the background to let you know this is how it was in this particular era. Think about all the movies you see today. Big, giant action scenes at the very beginning. Everything's got to be crazy for minute one. Because what they want to have is, on paper, they want to read something exciting from the very first paragraph. But I wrote the film Cuchulainn, which is about an Irish god, like a Jesus, 2,500 years before Christ. I wrote it, there's some exciting things at the beginning because the war begins at the beginning. So there's actually a very incredible scene I wrote at the beginning where a family gets slaughtered, minding their own business because the horde is coming. And a little boy escaped and got on horseback and rode to the king and said, look, they're coming, And the king's like, who's coming? And he says, death. But there's a little boy in the script for about, 5 pages. Because I'm letting the kid grow up. This god decides to send his son down to save Ireland. And so the kid needs to be born. It needs to be a virgin birth. We have to establish this. I wanted to establish the fact that the kid was loved by the village. And so I let him have like a few little scenes where he's being hugged and kissed. But he has these little fevers that he has because he's not quite right, because he's half god and half human. And he's in a tumultuous world. So it pains him to be in that world. And I had this little girl that ends up being his girlfriend go over to him and well, he's kind of passed out. He has no idea she's in the room, and she's touching him and kisses him on the forehead. And it seems like the fever subsides, and they end up becoming lovers later on. But the only major critique I got from Chris Hemsworth, who I wrote it for, was, wow, there doesn't seem to be that many lines for me. It was like 5 pages. But he's been trained. I'm Thor, I'm Captain Kirk. I immediately get on camera and I immediately suck down every pixel for me. He may not have that opinion today. He may understand the buildup is very important. But it's like, if your sex life were to go like an average Hollywood movie, the second you shook a woman's hand, you'd have an orgasm, right? Was it Sandberg's song, Jizz in Your Pants? It would just be constant orgasms constantly. You just don't have any foreplay. There's no getting to know anybody. This is Hollywood, kid. We got to keep things moving. It's like, oh, really? Because when this industry was built for 80 years, there was no problem with establishing shots. There was no problem with building up until something happened. Poltergeist, think about Poltergeist. Well, you establish the neighborhood first. We learn who the families are, who the parents, who the kids. What's the attitude of the dad? When the dad comes out to fight over the remote control with the neighbor, you get to learn about the neighbor. You get to learn about how they try to deal with selfishness, and they don't do too well. So they have this immaturity about them. Each one of them has a good case. One guy wants to entertain his kids. The other guy wants to entertain a bunch of his buddies. Then it's one day of the family functioning together before anything goes wrong. Because if a ghost shows up in the first scene, or a flicker of light, or something phenomenal happens in the first second of the film, okay, you got to keep outdoing the previous scene. You're going to run out of gap power really quickly. We've lost our way. When you write a book, well, hell, it's really simple. I was sitting with two other people today, and we were talking about the difference between the consciousness of film and the consciousness of a book. And I said to them, yeah, you're totally right. And this is how I write, so don't worry about it, but let's keep talking about it. Let's refresh all of our definitions and get on the same page with what this is. But I said, I've been sitting with you guys for 2 or 3 hours now, and I haven't read either one of your minds yet. But if this was a book, I would know exactly what you're thinking, because that's what a book can do. And people like that a little bit in a book. But when you're doing a film or television, it's all visual. It's all visual. If it didn't happen on camera, it never happened. The other element is, do human beings on an average day understand humanity and what makes us who we are? The number one faux pas today in actors is they don't act with their face. They act with their face for the second that their line is coming out of their mouth, and the second their line is done, they turn into like generic Bob, or they're not reflecting what's going on in the room. My huge critique that I've said before about the Solo film, this is someone trying to play an early Harrison Ford playing Han Solo. Now, despite the fact that the actor that they chose really doesn't look much like Harrison Ford unless you film him from the side, and they had 2 other options that were phenomenal, which I don't know why they didn't take it. But this actor smiled through the entire movie. Okay. How about we do this? We take Star Wars Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I put it on a cutting board inside Final Cut or whatever, and we're just going to cut every scene that Han Solo was in. There's not a single moment on this new version of the film we're going to create that doesn't have Han Solo scenes. And then I lock that actor in a box after he does his first line smiling on camera, just so he understands his mistake. I take all the air out of the box. But I give him a little scuba thing where he can breathe every once in a while. I say, okay, every time Han Solo smiles, you can take a breath. You ready for this? Here we go. He's going to die. He's going to die in, 3 to 5 minutes. Because Han Solo doesn't smile often. He smiles when he is manipulating. He is smiling when he wants something. Harrison Ford brilliantly designed the character such that he is a stoic dude. If he's bragging, he smiles. The actor missed the whole boat. And so many actors do nowadays because the directors don't have any balls to say, hey, stop smiling. I know you just got into a really amazing film franchise, but would you stop smiling? Carrie Fisher came back and she realized she kept the old skills going. Mark Hamill, he came back. He was very grumpy, but he understood. Walk around smiling. He's like, I'm on a movie. As much as this is great, I got a job to do. My character's not smiling. Take everybody in Solo who smiles. Oh my God. It's just constant. The whole thing is a big, oh my God, we're in a movie, we're in a movie, we're in a movie. So you can write some great stuff that has a lot of great consciousness frequency, but if the director doesn't have any balls to control his actors or her actors, your stuff's going to get just dissolved. If that's what you're going for. So everyone has to participate perfectly in creating this consciousness that is your film. Too much now, we get overhanded, hammed acting too. People trying to be profound too much. Take the new Blade Runner 2049. There is a replacement for Turkel's character, which is Dr. Tyrell, because Dr. Tyrell was killed in the first film many years ago. Turkel was able to pull out of Tyrell the most subtle brilliance out of his character, out of the action that he was portraying. His intelligence was implied. It was amazing. He didn't tell anyone in the movie that he invented the Nexus mind. The new movie? Oh my God, it was I invent worlds. I got millions. I'm so smart and I'm being very profound. And do you like my beard? Do you like my beard? Do you see this water effect on the wall? Water effect on the wall. If I'm not doing very good, if this scene sucks, focus on the water on the wall. Modern filmmaking. What's beautiful about what's going on now with film is that when you talk to, it's kind of a bad news, good news thing. The bad news is if you talk to the old pros who did amazing things in previous decades, in the 20th century, they will tell you that Hollywood is dead, that it is dead, dead, dead. Why? Because they've tried to pitch great scripts and they're just not being understood. And sometimes, bad scripts get pitched too. But if a great script came through, I was in a meeting once and we had to listen to this intern tell us how to make a movie who had no film degree, no writing education whatsoever, but she knew all about how to make film. We got out of the meeting and I got in the parking lot with my buddy who wrote the film. And he said, this industry is so screwed up. He says, you see that kid in there? That's what's wrong with Hollywood, right? We later found out that the producer of the president of the studio, that little division, was sleeping with the girls, so that's why she got in there. But he said if I brought Star Wars in there right now, they'd say, I like the script, but what is this Force crap? Get rid of this Force crap out of there. And I was like, yeah, you wouldn't have been able to convince me of that line 8 hours ago. But today, right now, having just been in that meeting, you're absolutely right. So the bad news is that Hollywood is failing miserably. Yeah, there's some movies that are absolutely phenomenal and you don't even know how they happen anymore. Like if I was running a studio, I'd look at TV and I'd look at Westworld and I go, oh my God, who's making that? Okay, Christopher Nolan and your whole writing team, you got to write me a movie because we're going to make this a movie, I need to sell tickets. I'm dying. I'm borrowing money left and right. We're $1.5 billion in debt by borrowing money. But the good news is they will fail. And if they don't change their ways, we're going to get continued crap. But the cool thing is someone is going to put together the way that we used to make films. It also has to do with the way the studios are organized internally, of course. They need to create their own staff and bring them back in-house so that a Sony MGM picture feels way different than a Universal picture, than a UA picture, whoever out there is making films. Disney films, they feel now like the Marvel world has a feeling. It doesn't even matter if they're creating a television show. They have a Marvel television feeling, consciousness that wraps all their stuff up. You can hate it or love it or whatever, but they're accurate to their franchise. I'm not a big Game of Thrones fan, but I couldn't possibly deny those writers the fact that they were true to their super clean medieval clothing constantly, right? Their world, it pleases their fans, and boy, do they have some fans. Westworld, for me, hit every single ball out of the park. You could just throw it. You could blindfold these writers and they would have just knocked out the park. Deadwood the same way. Carnival, absolute home run, the whole thing. When you can watch a series 3 to 5 times again and get more and more out of it, you're looking at masterful writing. Deadwood, the writing is intense. I mean, it's Shakespearean writing. It's Shakespearean acting. Phenomenal. These gems happen because these usually it's one core writer from the past sneaks into the future and is able to get something greenlit. But unfortunately, they get old and they can't continue doing it. So there's a lot of room out there is the good news for great writers. And it may be that you're putting a script on the shelf every 4 months. Let's say you're a professional writer able to crank something out in 4 months, 4 to 6, whatever. So you're able to create maybe 2 to 3 movies a year, and Hollywood isn't ready for you just yet. But you just keep them on the shelf. If you want to do something with them, pull them off, polish them up, put them back on the shelf, whatever it is. the proverbial shelf, the digital shelf these days. But eventually, the tides will turn and your stuff can get sold. And it will sell like, candy bars at a Willy Wonka factory. But imagine you're such a great writer. And I know that there are people out there that will argue this and they'll say, no. Hollywood spends $1 billion a year looking for great scripts and they simply can't find them. Maybe that's true. In a lot of cases, maybe it's not true. If agencies are the barrier between your stuff getting to a studio, well, geez, there's all kinds of just mechanical elements that compete with your stuff ever getting read because other stuff's coming in. It's first come, first serve. You're on a pile of 100 scripts, and you just got to wait your turn and hope that when your script's read, this is what studios might want to make. Sometimes you have to pine for things, but I want to make sure that you understand that if you're trying to create a consciousness in a script, there are some great examples, like I said. You can go back to old films that just happen to be filmed in their particular era. And as you sit there and you watch these things, ask yourself, why does Poltergeist feel like Poltergeist and not like it is today? Well, all those attributes that you write down, all of your little answers, take notes. Watch a movie and take notes. There were, landmark films. And if you feel like, well, that's just old farty stuff, you probably don't get it. But if you go, oh, I see. Yeah, I see. Oh, yeah, man, that's totally different. Man, we don't act like that anymore, do we? These people seem so goofy. Well, imagine that you were coming up with a really great story that should probably exist in those older time frames, those older decades. Well, there's your list. There's your hit list of all the things that you have to do to create that consciousness in your script. Obviously, if you lived in the era and the time that the drama is occurring, you're pre-qualified. If you're not pre-qualified, you got to go find those people and have those conversations. What was it like? Tell me. And they may fail the first attempt to tell you, but go ahead and ask them again. Well, no, okay, but wait a minute. What makes a person different back in those days? It's funny when you talk to older people, you sense that older consciousness, their era. You talk to a grandmother who's, say, in her 60s or higher, they will have, and you're in your 20s or 30s or what have you, there's just a different way you talk to them. You don't bring them all the slang and stuff that you say with your friends because they won't understand what you're talking about. There's your consciousness. There's your culture. The substrate of what you're trying to write. And as much as people will say naively that constraints are a bad thing, in writing constraints, even if you don't completely understand them at the very beginning, if you just keep thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, there'll be this cracking moment where you're going, oh God, yeah, that's fantastic. Because of that there's this, and then there's that, and there's less for you to choose from. It's like going from a normal Rubik's Cube to a Rubik's Cube with like the normal Rubik's Cube is your goal. Very simple to understand. It's complicated, but you can solve the thing. To a Rubik's Cube with like 100 sides, and it's as big as a medicine ball, and you're like, whoa, it's going to take me my whole lifetime to solve this thing, if I'm lucky. That's the world without constraints. You want constraints because it'll force your hand. It'll constrain your mind. Anyway, I want to put this together before I lost my train of consciousness because it's a real thing. I often think that, it's not that because I write this way, I write consciousness scripts. That's what I do. It doesn't mean I'm completely accurate at getting out what I'm trying to get out. But the basics are always covered. I hope this was valuable. It's just a little annex on the skill of writing. And again, I was told today that there's a whole book about it, and it's a classic book about it. I have never heard anyone bring it up to me, so I'm very glad that they did today. Make sure this is something I consciously think about. But if you haven't thought that through, then there you go. You have some tools now that you can add to give yourself a little bit more dimension. If you have a fairly decent story, but it doesn't have a character, doesn't have a style, maybe going back at the, sit off to the side, put your script off to the side. You should always take a break from your script, because take a week off. It sounds crazy. If you got a deadline, obviously don't do that, but push it off for a week, think about it. And then in that week, just write down more things about the environment and the world and what makes it what it is. And then check your script to make sure that stuff's in there at the right time when it would really accentuate. When you're establishing your script at the very first 5 pages, make sure you're constantly putting in these elements to make sure everyone understands. You may not need to continually pound it over the entire course of the script because people will eventually get it and they'll start being invested in your characters more than your story. But everyone has to understand that once the script is delivered. So you might put some forceful language in your script about this is the way it is and it's not another way. So that everyone reading goes, oh, okay, all right, yeah, that is the way it is. I understand. It'll help you out in the end. It'll show your maturity in writing. I think that's all I got on that one. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. I'm going to make a short bumper today. There's 2 video, 2 audio, 2 social media, 2 ways to donate to the page, and a season 1 link. You will not find season 1 on this channel, but it exists on a different channel. Just go to the website and you'll find it. Until next time, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you on the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.